I have to attend. I slip out the door. I will not be here for her talk, but she's going to speak again later, so we'll have another opportunity. My remarks today will be very brief. There's more detail in my report, in the annual report of fiscal year 23, getting ahead of myself. But there are some key points. The first key point is, and it's a spoiler alert for Dawn, I won't say too much, Dawn, but we're in good fiscal shape. And that's a really nice thing to be able to say. Dawn will fill you in more on what that means in a moment. We're doing more again in the post-COVID period that we had put off before. We're doing live events again. We did the Vermont Eats at the Pearl Street Pizza establishment in Barrie. We did our Freedom and Unity luncheon after putting it off for a couple of years at the Capitol Plaza. We're doing more videos. We're producing more and more videos for the public to view. I think fiscal year 23, we did 75 new videos on objects in our collection. We're doing exhibits. We're going to have an open storage gallery here. Funding from Congress is going to allow that to happen. And that's something we're trying to do. We're trying to rustle up membership. We had a raffle which gave a free trip to Rome to someone, and I'm happy to say that neither a trustee nor anybody on the staff won. Oral history is strong on our last year, fiscal year 23. We kicked off our COVID-19 Vermont study project. We're taking oral histories on a great number of people about their experiences in the COVID pandemic period. Education is one of our missions, as you know. Several new hands-on history programs were created for K through 12 during that fiscal year. And we've welcomed some new staff as well. We've lost some people to retirement and to moving on. We've got a new director of finance and operations, Jennifer Blair. Is Jennifer here in the room? Raise your hand. Danielle Harris Burnett has joined us. Raise your hand. And she's the outreach educator. Sorry, I misspoke. We have a new outreach educator, Meg Mallory. Hello. And our director of stewardship and public relations, Emily Lev. And I think she's in the other room. So a lot going on. Looking forward, and it's not my job to talk about the forward part of this. We're talking about the just finished fiscal year. But just to give you an impression of what's happening right now, we're in the process of strategic planning again. And it seems like we're always strategically planning, but we're really in the thick of it now. And many of our staffers, all of our trustees are involved in interviewing many of the stakeholders, people who donate to us, people who rely on us for education, and interviewing them and finding out what they think we should be doing, what they think we do, what they think we could do more of. And those are very interesting interviews. I've conducted about 4 of them myself, and it's an eye-opening experience to talk to people who are strong donors and find out what things they know about us and what things they don't. And that'll be very good for us. Okay, I'm going to wrap up my talk now. We've got one other thing to do. First thing, I'm retiring as president. I'll be leaving at the board meeting in November. Fortunately, the society will be in good hands with Jan Albers, who's agreed to be on the slate when we vote in November, and I think she will be the next president, if I have anything to say about it anyway. And but our next item of business is to get a motion on the slate of trustees that's been put forward. I can read them to you. It's the slate of trustees. It's the governance committee of the Board of Trustees presents the following slate of candidates as trustees. As you know, candidate biographies were available. Hopefully you looked at them. Janet Ansell is in her third, or will be in her third. David Austin in his second. Allison Belisle, I'm repeating what's already on the, so I don't have to do that for you unless any, I guess maybe it would help for people who may be listening. Randy Brock, 26 would be his first. He previously served. Catherine Lally, 26 first. Anthony Amaro, 26 first. Donald Miller, 26 first. And Wright Preston, 26 first. So there we have it. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, sir. Do we have a second? Okay, Sarah, thank you. Any discussion? just so you know, those folks who are on Zoom, if you voted and sent in a ballot, please don't vote again. We're going to be tallying the votes from the people who are appearing on Zoom. So we wouldn't want you to have two votes. Let's have a vote. All in favor of the slate, please raise your hand. Anybody disagree with the slate? And I think the vote is carried. I don't have a way of counting. Were you going to count as well?
We're watching them online. There were 74 mail ballots, all in the affirmative.
Okay. And I think the majority was here. I don't think there were any nays, and unless there were some abstentions, I forgot to ask about that, but I don't. Okay. I think we've done what I needed to do. And our next speaker is Dawn, right? Thank you.
So I am also going to keep my remarks brief so we can get on to the more exciting part of the program today. I'm Dawn Schneiderman, the treasurer of the Historical Society. I've been the treasurer for quite a number of years now. I did make a few notes. I don't know if we're going to put up there we go. Yeah. So in the room, it might be a bit small. Hopefully on Zoom, you can see a little bit better. The bottom line message is the one that Crocker shared already, that we're in a strong financial position. It's so rewarding to hear Crocker recap all of the exciting things that are happening at the Historical Society. It's our financial stability that allows us to pursue our mission. And I think we're really doing a great job with that. As you can see, we have three main sources of revenue. The generosity of the state is important. If we have anybody either on the phone or in the room who's either among our esteemed legislature or otherwise supports us at the state, thank you very much. Your support is important. We pursue a number of grants. Most of our grants are for specific purposes. They really do help us with our mission. When we have bigger or exciting or more intensive projects, the grants help us considerably. And then, of course, and tremendously important is the support from our members. I'm assuming the people here in the room, the people on the phone are all members of the society. And we really, really do appreciate your support. It's you that allow us to do what we do. On the expense side, as you'll see, most of our expenses do go towards our mission. Things like public programs, library, museum and collections, all of the things that we know and love about the society, and what our great folks who are on staff are bringing to us every day. The one small thing I wanted to point out, I think it's on a footnote here. It was in the actual annual report, but there is a little footnote that says our operating revenues support our operating expenses. That if you step back and you take out things like depreciation and interest earnings and sort of all of that accounting type stuff, what the statement that I said is really what we pursue is that the revenues that come in for operations support our operations and that we're balanced there. And we are balanced, and it's exciting, very exciting to me to see the mission of the organization carried out through the monies and the revenues that we receive each year. I think that's it. I was going to talk a bit about the impact of the museum closures, but Steve has some late breaking news on that, so I'll skip that. And that's about it. I guess I would just leave you with saying thank you for your support. It means a lot. It allows us to do what we do. And hopefully you are feeling that through not only your participation throughout the year, but some of the cool things that we'll be talking about today. So thanks all. I guess I have to ask if anyone has any questions before I wind down. I'm hoping not, but if anyone does have a question, certainly feel free to throw that out there, or anybody on the phone. I guess over here, I need to be looking at the camera for those on the phone. In fact, I'm pleased to see how many people we have on the phone. There's quite a number here in the room. It's a great annual meeting. All right, thank you all. And it looks like Steve is next. Grab my papers.
Don't take my papers. The challenge. All right. Thank you so much, Crocker. Thank you, Don.
I'll take over the remote control here. We did have the balance sheet, but it just tells you the same financial story in a different way, and that the assets of the society are growing. It did grow year over year. One of the things that wasn't in my remarks, but it does relate to Dawn's remarks, and it relates to the reason it's a little bit toasty in this room right now. Last year, we received a supplementary appropriation from the state in the general bill. Again, thank you very much to our legislators for that. That is paying for a replacement of our HVAC system here at VHS. We've been waiting on parts forever, as you can imagine, and it's been put off. They started work on it last week, and they'll be bringing in some large chiller units and fans and things like that on tractor trailer trucks next week. So we're really excited about that. It'll take us at least through the next 20 years, not having to replace some of these major systems in this building. It's wonderful news for us. On the downside, it's a little toasty today because the system's a little janky, if we want to use that term. So anyway, Stephen Perkins, I'm the executive director of the Vermont Historical Society, as it says on the screen. Thank you all for joining us. I believe we had over 100 people registered for the annual meeting. This is the first time we've tried doing this in a hybrid manner. Of course, prior to the pandemic, it was all in person, and then we did the whole pandemic thing and it was all online, and we saw great participation online. So we felt we needed to keep that option. And so we're trying to balance that with what we're doing here today. So for those in the room, thank you for making the trip out here to Barrie to join us in person, and those online, thank you very much for your participation. Crocker did a nice overview of many of the activities from last year. So I know this is supposed to be the annual meeting and the annual report on FY23, but I really did want to talk about the elephant in the room, especially for this organization in central Vermont, and that is the flooding that we experienced. So you have received communications from me. You heard, we tried to update all of you as members in real time as to the impact on our organization and our community. So both Barrie and Montpelier were devastated by these flooding and still recovering right now. Vermont Historical Society, from a collection standpoint, was safe. And that is certainly due to the forward thinking of board and staff back in the early 90s after the flood of 92, and said, you know what? It's not safe for us to keep all of our collections and our archives in the basement of the Pavilion building where they'd been since 1973, and was moved to this site. And that's really why we have this location. So just to reiterate, other than the items that are on view currently in the first floor museum in Montpelier, all of our collections are here in Barrie, up on the hill. We didn't escape it. There was a lot of water. There was a lot of hydraulic pressure here, and we did have some water incursion into our spaces, but nothing was harmed. It was mitigated very quickly. And I definitely want to thank a number of our dedicated staff who made their way here during the storm, during the flooding, in the days after the flooding, when Barrie was an island and you couldn't get in and out. We had staff members who lived here. One, I won't embarrass him, showed up on his bike to help clean up. So that's a dedication to staff to be here for our locations. Montpelier was a different story. The Pavilion building was severely impacted and has been offline since the day of the flood. Therefore, the Vermont History Museum has been closed since July 11th. The impact on us as an organization is profound as it relates to earned revenue. So as you can imagine, summer and fall tourism is the bread and butter for our earned revenue. And I want to make that clear that that's going to be a challenge this year for us. However, as Don said, on to the good news. Thank you so much to the state of Vermont and Buildings and General Services who really focused on our area of the pavilion. And I just received word earlier this week that our staff is going to be able to get back into the museum this coming Monday. And we are going to take about a week to move materials back to the museum, get cleaned up, and be ready to welcome visitors on the 10th of October. So please, if you want to come visit us, and we welcome, please come visit us on the 10th. That's Tuesday the 10th. We'll be reopening the museum in Montpelier. There will be a new exhibit brought to us by the Middletown Springs Historical Society, was put off all summer long. They're very excited. They'll be installing next week, as well as our exhibits currently on view in Montpelier. So we're happy to be reopened, and thank you very much to the state of Vermont. The rest of the building is not open, but they worked really hard to get our place on that first floor reopened. As a little side note, Andrew Liptak, who runs our guest services and our bookstore, wants to let you all know that he has got today only has a temporary bookstore set up upstairs in the library. So for those in the building, so after we get done with our program today, please go up and visit Andrew, because every book you buy today, we don't have to move back over to Montpelier next Monday. So it's been a fascinating year. It's been a really good year. We're looking forward to more good work from the Historical Society, more telling Vermont's stories in every way that we can. I'm going to move on now to the Richard Hathaway Award, which we give out yearly. The Richard Hathaway Award, some people know as Dick, is presented annually to an individual, group, or organization recognized as making an outstanding contribution to the field of Vermont history. Projects may include, but are not limited to, publications, exhibits, works of art, documentary films, radio programs, websites, and dramatic works. The Hathaway Award was created to stimulate outstanding work in the field of Vermont history. It is dedicated to the memory of Richard Hathaway, whose lifelong work teaching Vermont history was an inspiration to his colleagues and to the many students he taught and mentored both inside and outside of academia. So this year, the Vermont Historical Society is pleased to present the Hathaway Award to George Bellerose in his book, Portraits of a Forest, Men and Machine, published by the Vermont Folklife Center. Bill Schubart, who was one of the nominators of this publication, writes, and as you all know, Bill writes very well, so I'm just going to read his words about this book. Portrait of a Forest is a vital document in Vermont's history of working the land. I've seen many books and other media about logging in my time. The Northeast Film Archive was a client of my business for many years, and I was intimate with a lot of media documenting logging life in New England. For all the books I've seen or collected, Mr. Bellerose's is the finest example, both from a research, presentation, and production standpoint. It's far and away the most accurate and broad-ranging look at Vermont forestry I've seen. It'll be an enduring testament to the forest, the men, machines, and businesses that have harvested it. The primary source, firsthand testamentary structure of this book brings alive the sources and voices of those who actually do the work. It's not, as is so often the case, told through the pen of an interpreter. This diversity of voices allows the author to inform us in multiple ways, with a variety of voices coming from different sectors of the industry. This gives us a trusted overview of forestry in Vermont from its beginnings to today. So congratulations to George. You can buy this book from us, and you can buy this book from the Vermont Folklife Center, and it's a good read. It's a fun read. And so now I hear that this is why most people actually come to our annual meeting. I think early on in my tenure, this is my 8th year at Vermont Historical Society. Early on in my tenure, we didn't do this. And I heard about it afterwards. So want to make sure that we cover some of the recent accessions to VHS collections. So I'm going to do double duty here, and I'm going to talk about both museum collections editions and library collections editions. I want to thank the library staff for giving me some language to read on the items that were selected as gifts to the library. And thank you to Teresa Green, our collections manager, for the information provided on the collections items. Last summer, time starts to get blurry. I can't remember if it was in July. Maybe we met with them in June. The items came in the end of July. We were invited up to a Victorian home, probably would have been called a mansion of sorts in the 1890s, and in Jeffersonville, Vermont, by the family of Dr. Roger Mann. The building still contained his entire, he called it his hospital. We would probably call it a clinic today. As well as his antiquarian bookselling business. So he did double duty. In his retirement, he was an antiquarian bookseller. But it was a fascinating glimpse into the life of a Vermont doctor from the late 1930s up to when he ended practicing in the early 1990s. So he was born in 1911 in Waterville, Vermont. He left Waterville long enough to go to college in Massachusetts and then the UVM College of Medicine. And in 1939, he returned to Waterville, Vermont, where he built his practice. He originally practiced out of his home until opening this hospital and medical practice on Maple Street in Jeffersonville in the mid-1940s. He maintained this practice until 1991 when he retired from medicine and moved to the antiquarian book business. In addition to medicine, he was very active in the local schools and advocated for the new Union High School and Technical Center, and he chaired the regional board that facilitated the sale and development of Smuggler's Notch to the Watson family and created the Smuggler's Notch ski resort. He was a family practitioner, first and foremost, and he provided medical services both from birth to death. What's interesting about the collection that we selected to bring here? Why this country doctor? Why not another country doctor? Early in Dr. Mann's career, he took a particular notice of women's health, especially noting the high mortality rate of mothers in rural areas. The reason he founded this hospital in Jeffersonville, Vermont, was originally as a maternity hospital. And it provided birthing rooms and postnatal care that included meal preparation, childcare instruction, and a place to recover with 24-hour nursing for new mothers. This was unheard of in rural Vermont at the time. And we took a number of his medical instruments that relate to women's healthcare, and the item, well, this is signed from his office, but what you see in the picture, it's a little big. It's a incubator for preemies. As far as we know, this was the first modern manufactured or purpose-built incubator in the state of Vermont, and it was in his hospital in Jeffersonville, not in hospitals in Barre, Montpelier, or Burlington. I call it the Easy Bake Oven of incubators. It runs on a light bulb. It's absolutely fascinating. It has an incandescent light bulb in it that runs on a rheostat, and that's how the temperature is maintained in the device. So a fascinating collection of artifacts from the family wanted us to take everything. You know, we couldn't take a full-size X-ray machine. We have limited spaces here. We took a few medical items, this being the largest item, and then a large number of archival material that is waiting to be processed in our library and archives at this point. The library received, as a donation from Ricky Gard Diamond, a collection of the issues of Vermont Woman magazine. And this is a run from 1985 to 2018, including the very first issue. These were donated alongside mementos and other publications from the 75th anniversary of women's suffrage. If you all remember, we did the 100th a couple years, 4 years ago. The miscellaneous publications and written material dealing with women's rights, education, and family issues. These are very important addition to our collection and highlight the achievements of Vermont women and their contributions to the fight for equality. Fascinating stuff. I think you've all probably seen hair work. It's usually the ooh and on, oh, how could they do that sort of thing that you put up on a screen. This one also illustrates another way that items come into our collection, and that's through institutional transfer. So we do work with institutions around the country. And as we find things in our collections that maybe don't belong here in the Vermont Historical Society, our board will vote and we'll transfer them to another institution. The same thing happens elsewhere. This was discovered in an inventory that was taking place at the New Hampshire Historical Society, and they contacted us, and this was transferred to VHS this past year. What you're looking at is a frame display of 12 locks of hair secured beneath paper hearts, and the pieces of paper are 2 hearts, and they're like woven together with really kind of cool paperwork. The hair it's memento or genealogical in manner, and it contains hair from the members of the Beatty, Gillespie, and Gibson families of Reigate, Vermont. So I know sometimes we look at this and say, ooh, how could they save hair? But prior to easily accessible photographs, or you couldn't afford a portrait painter or whatnot, hair was an enduring memento to remember a loved one with. This is a display. We also see hair jewelry, which we have in our collection as well. Anyone know who this is? Look at the eyes. Yeah, Betty Davis. So this was donated from Paula Emery, and it's a photograph of Betty Davis at the Memorial Auditorium in Rutland on February 11th, 1942. Betty was on a campaign to promote war bonds along with her husband, Arthur Farnsworth, and she ended up visiting Barrie after Rutland. The photo was taken at a ball in her honor, where she pledged to dance with anyone who contributed $1,000 or more. It was reported in the newspaper that she sold $30,000 in war bonds at that one event. While in Rutland, she did also visit the schools, and she sang with the children's choirs in the schools. 2 items here, somewhat related. One addition to the archive and one in addition to the collection. This is a print of the first Vermont State waterfowl stamp by artist Jim Killen or Kylan. I apologize if I don't pronounce his name right. And it was donated by Joanna Caswell. The print is, as I said, Vermont's first state waterfowl stamp. We know these as duck stamps as well. You may have heard that term. The purpose behind them is to raise money for conservation of waterfowl and wetlands. So any hunter over the age of 16 years of age must purchase one of these along with their hunting license. Jim Killen, he's a renowned wildlife artist. He's also painted the art used by duck stamps for South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Idaho, Illinois, and a few other locations. We think it's a beautiful print, but it's also an important part of Vermont's history of both hunting and conservation. Next to it, probably 100 years earlier than the print, is a decoy, and again, another way that items come into our collection. This is an institutional purchase. We saw this item come up for auction and noticed that it had been published in Decoys of Lake Champlain by Dr. Loy S. Harrell, which is one of kind of the great reference books of decoy makers here in Vermont. So we were able to pick this up and add it to the collection. It was used by A.G. Fournier, or Fournier, depending on what generation French he was in Vermont, for hunting on Lake Champlain. And it was probably made by his hunting partner and well-known decoy carver, George Bacon of Burlington. Some Bennington County folks here in the room. This is a donation of charcoal burning kilns in Danby, Vermont. And this comes to us from Vic Rolando. It's a photo from the 1880s of Silas L. Griffith's charcoal kilns and offices in Danby. Silas Griffith, 1837 to 1903, was born in Danby and became a highly successful businessman owning a fairly large lumber operation. He later added charcoal manufacturing to his business and was at one time the single largest producer of charcoal in the United States. Again, speaking to the audience that probably already knows this, at one point in our history, Vermont was only about 20% forested. We had denuded about 80% of our landscape, talked about in George's book, by the way. When the lumber they didn't have the lumber for to run through the sawmill or cordwood, the remainder was burned down into the charcoal. So a complete usage. I'm having a hard time seeing it on the screen, but the kilns are in the background of this image. And if you maybe want to make an appointment to come visit us and see it, it's rare to find good imagery of charcoal kilns. Another Southern Vermont gift here. This is representative of a larger collection. We received both archival and artistic collection representing the work of Pasquale Santo. We know him as Patsy Santo down south. Sorry, I just always call him Patsy Santo. He was born in Corsano, Italy on December 25th, 1893. And in his early 20s, he came to the United States, moved to kind of the capital district of New York. And then ultimately in 1917, married a woman from Bennington and settled in Bennington. His children, I believe, are still alive. Are they, Callie, Violetta, and Carl? Anyway, the family is still resident in Bennington, and the gift comes through Tom Fells, but also as a gift of the family. He chose house painting as a career, but he also painted murals. And he painted small pieces for friends and family. He liked to paint things. So this is a good example of painting things. And it's a great representation of Bennington with the Catamount statue, which is near the site of the former Catamount Tavern. This is a shoe brush. There are other painted items, as well as his artist easel and some other materials. There are also archival materials that came in this collection. He's becoming more and more known, well known in the folk art scene. He showed in 1937 at the State Fair in Rutland, and he caught the eye of Walt Kuhn, brought him to New York. Of course, he showed a lot of folk artists were showing in New York at the time. He showed at the Marie Harriman Gallery in 1940, and then he later was in the show Unknown American Artists at MoMA. And then Sidney Janis included him in his book, They Taught Themselves. So often he's considered a modern primitive, and his work is often shown alongside Grandma Moses. And it's in the permanent collections of MoMA, Whitney, Corcoran, and the Bennington Museum. So we also, as part of this, acquired a very nice large scale Santo painting, which is currently in Boston. We have to go pick it up. The library collection, a donation from Robin Van Mechelen, the Vermont Militia promotion document for Stephen Greenleaf Jr. This is a document detailing the promotion of Stephen Greenleaf Jr. His dates are 1759 to 1850 of Brattleboro to second sergeant in the Vermont Militia. The document is dated 1788. Aside from being a soldier in the Revolutionary War, he was self-educated and a carpenter by trade, as well as Brattleboro's town clerk. This adds to our collection of his papers and letters currently in our archive. People read that, and you can get why we've added this to our collection. So I think we all know that Senator Patrick Leahy retired, and in the process of cleaning out both his Washington office and his Burlington office, formal papers have all gone to UVM, but kind of personal objects and things that he kept to remember his career and also think about his homestay of Vermont did come to us. And so we have a nice collection of items that came from the senator upon his retirement. And this is just an example. I thought it was a fun example. It's a print that his staff created for him from two Rutland Herald two Rutland Herald banners, less than a week apart. If you can't read it, they're both from 1974, obviously. Friday, November 1st. So this is the Friday before Election Day. The headline says, Chittenden poll dooms Leahy. And then Wednesday, November 6th, which would be the day after Election Day, the headline, Leahy upsets Mallory, wins Aiken's seat. So I won't go into great detail. I think everybody knows this story, but he was the youngest Vermont senator in history and the first Democratic senator since 1856. And upon his retirement, he was the third longest serving senator in history. We do have his biography in the library if you'd like to read it. Not too far off from Leahy's election. I guess about a decade. This is a donation from Erica McCormick. This is the itinerary for Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson's visit to Vermont in 1963. It's a typewritten schedule of the arrangements for Vice President Johnson's visit on October 25th, 1963. And it was given to the donor by her father, John Spencer, who was a special assistant to Governor Hough. and made all of the arrangements for this visit. The first item on the agenda was Vice President Johnson and his wife arriving at the Barry Montpelier Airport. That's where they flew in at 11:45 and greeted by Governor Hoff, his wife, a platoon of National Guard, the National Guard band and drill team, as well as a 19-gun salute. The party then continued to Montpelier High School, the state office buildings, and a luncheon at the Brown Derby Motel on Northfield Street in Montpelier. At 3 p.m., they departed for Burlington, and there's pages of that as well. John, do you recognize this? John Dunville? No. Well, this is a gift from John Dunville, used by his father to send eggs from the family farm in South Royalton to friends and family in New York and New Jersey during World War II. Reusable crates like this were common and would be sent back and forth multiple times. The address label is typed on one side with Robert Dunville's address. A paper insert with handwritten address for those receiving the eggs is also included. The one that is currently on the box is for Rudolph Kind of Garden City, Long Island. So fascinating piece of Vermont agricultural history. Venetian ginger ale. Another way that items come into our collection. So as many of you have seen, since 2016, I've been doing this little TV show called At This Place in History, where I run around the state and get really excited about cool places in history and talk to people about what they have and what they're going to show me. And so this past year, we ended up at the Soda Lounge in the soda plant on Pine Street, talking to Justin Bunnell, who is the current owner of this brand name, and talking about his family's history in bottling, and specifically the resurrection of the Venetian ginger ale brand. And of course, as I was leaving, he said, "Do you have any of these in the pcollection?" I said, "I'm sure we don't." And he put two in my hand, and off we went and add these to the collection. So I encourage you to go online, check out the video. It's a lot of fun, a lot of great images of kind of Prohibition era folks on Pine Street in Burlington. But kind of in a nutshell, the history really is about the M&FC Dorn Company. And that was started by Michael Charles Dorn, who was a German Jew. He was born in 1871 and in 1883 immigrated as a 12-year-old with an uncle to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. About 10 years later, he settled in Burlington and opened a restaurant in the Strong Theater. In that restaurant, he experimented with sodas and mixed drinks and thought that he really liked that more than running a restaurant. So he created the MC or M and FC. He added his son to the letters there, created a bottling company to bottle sodas and also bottle at the time when bottled beverages were distributed, they were shipped in barrels to a central point who would then rebottle them. And that's one of the things that the Dorn Company did. Of course, you should see the pictures of this company from Prohibition, and you can guess that they weren't just bottling soda. And there's a lot of great documented rum running, shall we say, on Lake Champlain to this company, which would then bottle it through its bottling plant. And so also at the same time during Prohibition, they created the Venetian ginger ale because people couldn't buy alcoholic beverages. So this is something that they could create and sell to the general public. I love the name. Why Venetian? You know, is this some Italian recipe? No, the Van Dorn, the Dorn Bottling Company was next door to the Venetian Blind Company in Burlington, which was very well known, one of the largest wooden blind makers in the world. And so they named their ginger ale after their next door neighbor, the Venetian Wooden Blind Company. So hence Venetian ginger ale. They stopped making their own sodas after World War II and just focused on bottling. And they became a pretty well-known bottler and finally sold the business in 1985. It stayed in the family until that point. the kind of cool thing is that Justin is a great grandson of Michael Dorn. He was born in Georgia. He didn't really know this family story. He moved back to Vermont, was working in film editing and creation, and started to dig up some of these soda bottles in a family home. He's like, what is this all about? And started researching this whole family history. And sure enough, his film business, Retro Media, is in the soda plant, which was the Dorn soda plant. It's now a business incubator space on Pine Street. And so he went ahead and he found the old recipes, tinkered with them, and created a small startup. And you can buy Venetian ginger ale again in co-ops and small stores throughout Vermont. So great story, probably dwelled on that really long. I find this stuff exciting. I hope you do too. This is another item donated to the Library and Archives from Joe Ellen Kubler. It's the discharge paper for Thomas Carswell. So Thomas Carswell is from Barrie, and the discharge paper is dated 1898. He was born in Scotland. He immigrated to Barrie with his family when he was 12, and he was a member of the Barrie Company E and fought in the Spanish-American War. When he mustered out, as recorded on this document, he rejoined the National Guard and served as a captain of the Barrie Company. He ultimately went on to be a prominent Barrie granite manufacturer. So this adds to our collection of Barrie history. This is a model train. It's the 1976 bicentennial train. So some of you may remember the bicentennial train that traveled around the country. It had exhibits and that came through Vermont. This model was made by Frederick Bryce. For those of you that followed, let's say, folk art and the whims of Electra Havemeyer Webb in the 1970s, you may have heard of Frederick Bryce. He was a child immigrant to this country. His family owned a number of apartment buildings on South Champlain Street in Burlington, and that's where he ended up living his life there. He was his trade was he drove for the Vermont Transit Company. But in his spare time, he made model after model after model after model. And he generally specialized in historic structures, many of which are now lost to time, Vermont historic structures. He was recognized by Electra Havemeyer Webb as an up-and-coming folk artist, and his works were displayed at the Shelburne Museum in the 1970s. He was also regularly featured in local media each time he produced a new model, and there were tours that were offered of his home to see the models. The family, he died a while ago, but his family just really didn't know what to do with the models, and ultimately they ended up selling the collection at auction. And again, this is a way that items come into our collection. Donors, Aaron and Rebecca Goldberg, were there to purchase his model of a Havi synagogue for the synagogue, and they purchased 3 models to donate to the Vermont Historical Society. So the bicentennial train, which I thought was apt for the upcoming 250th coming up here in a few years, as well as a carousel and another small model. This was a diary donated from Nancy Twitchell. It's a diary of John Twitchell of Burlington, Vermont, and was written during his military service between June 1945 and March 1946. It details his time in Europe, including hearing about the end of the war over the radio while stationed in Austria. It really is an excellent snapshot of a Vermonter's life as a soldier and his thoughts about the events of the war. I also had to say his handwriting is really easy to read. So it's a very accessible diary. It's very neat. The whole thing reads like this. Interestingly enough, he was the grandson of Marshal Twitchell, who was a soldier in the 4th Vermont Regiment during the Civil War. And Marshal Twitchell's papers are also in the VHS archives. So just kind of shows that kind of ongoing addition to these archives, which makes our collections so rich. These are gangway boards. These are a gift of Neil Hogan. They're reported to be the doors of the USS, the gunboat USS Bennington, not to be confused with the aircraft carrier. I feel they're probably from the USS Vermont. So they did come out of a home in Bennington. Now, what, pray tell, are gangway boards? So these are specialized wooden panels, often carved by the sailors at sea, usually of tropical hardwoods. And they were very common, say, from the American Civil War up through World War I. They really started to phase out during World War I. But they're angled, as you can see, and they have notches in the back. They fit into the gap on the rail on the side of a ship. So when a gangway is attached, not when it's necessarily at port, when a gangway is attached, if they're have a visiting dignitary or piping on a new officer or whatever, these boards would block off the ends of the railings as they walked up this decorative gangway. And the boards were always carved in reference to the ship's name. And so these, I'll tell you a little, well, you can see on them, we have the Vermont crest on one side and then the Vermont flag on the other. What I love about these pieces is that's the Vermont flag from this time period. So we just did some stuff this past June on the 100th anniversary of the current Vermont flag. This is prior to that. So that's the Vermont flag prior to the blue with the crest that we have now. It was red and white stripes with a star with the kind of state crest in the middle of the star. Of the flag. So the story is that it came off the USS Bennington. The USS Bennington was commissioned in 1891 and spent most of its career in the Pacific. On its way to join the Pacific Squadron during the Philippine War, it claimed Wake Island, which of course became a very strategic claim on behalf of the US come World War II. In 1905, while at anchor in San Diego Harbor, one of the boilers exploded and it killed 66 men and injured almost everyone else on board. The ship was beached, was in an emergency manner to prevent it from sinking, but it was deemed a total loss. There is a monument, by the way, in San Diego Harbor. A little hard to find, I hear. It's a miniature model of the Bennington battle monument from Bennington, but it's in San Diego Harbor, and it's a monument to the men that died on the USS Bennington. All of the reports were it was pretty much destroyed by fire. So the survivability of wooden doors like this is I'm not sure is correct. And also the boards would have been carved to its name, and its name was the Bennington, not the Vermont. So the fact that it's a Vermont crest and a Vermont flag, one would have thought being carved to Bennington, it may have had the battle monument on it because that was brand new at the time, or something else with that. I think it came off the USS Vermont. The USS Vermont was a battleship commissioned in 1907 and commissioned in 1920. It was part of the decommissioned in 1920, sorry. It was part of the Great White Fleet and later was used as a training vessel during World War I. It didn't blow up, it didn't get sunk or anything, it was just decommissioned. And upon decommissioning, all of her naval accoutrements were sent to officials and politicians in Vermont. So the Silver Service and Ship's Bell are currently part of the State House collection, and it's more than likely that the ship's boards of this part of gift ended up in the home of the prominent Robinson family of Bennington. Robinsons had senators and governors and whatnot in their family, and that's where these boards came out of. They came out of that house. So anyway, very interesting pieces. We'll be installing them later in our open storage facility once it's built. And the last piece, I know I went on and on here, but I love museum pieces and I love museums. Maybe a little hard to see, this is baseball. This is a gift of former director Kevin Grafnino in the back here, amongst other gifts, but I wanted to highlight this one. It's signed by Howard Frank Mosher. And of course, we lost him in 1917. His fictionalized Kingdom County really gave voice to the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and definitely a Vermont of a generation. Though mostly writing fiction, Mosher was not afraid to take on events and people of Vermont, most famously, I think, the Irisburg Affair through his novel A Stranger in the Kingdom. For those that read all of his books, though, you know that baseball, especially the Boston Red Sox, are a through line within almost every single story. We do carry his writings in our library, but it's wonderful to have a personal object connection to him that's meaningful, such as this baseball. So I'm going to wrap up my remarks there. That's just a small smattering of things that have been added to the collection of the Historical Society over the past year. Keep them coming. If you've got stuff, we'll take your stuff. So now I've probably gone way over time, right, Amanda? But we're all here for the program. We're all here. In 2019, VHS published an article in the Vermont History Journal by Dartmouth scholar Mercedes de Guardiola. It was entitled Segregation or Sterilization Eugenics in the 1912 Vermont State Legislative Session. Over the next 4 years, our editorial board, led by managing editor Alan Berolsheimer, worked with Mercedes to use her copious research and craft it into a book-length study of the genesis, implementation, and outcomes of the eugenics movement here in Vermont. So we're really happy to have Mercedes here with us today. We're providing a member's preview of her work. There will be a more formal, more lengthy presentation coming up on November 9th for the public, and I encourage you to come back for that as well. So now for the formal introduction. Mercedes DeGuardiola is a New York-based historian. She earned her BA from Dartmouth College with a double major in history and art history. She's a leading expert on Vermont's eugenics movement. She testified before the state legislature during hearings in the 2020s. Her research examines public policies of child health and welfare, mass institutionalization and deinstitutionalization, sterilization, and family separation. Mercedes works in open innovation consulting at Luminary Labs for clients including NASA, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So with that, welcome. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. So thank you to the Vermont Historical Society for having me here today. As Steve mentioned, I first began my research 8 years ago at Dartmouth, and I am very grateful to Alan and the entire team here for bringing it to the public. And I'm thrilled to be here today with you to discuss this research of eugenics and our understanding of what happened in Vermont. Okay, so to start off with, what is eugenics? Eugenics is a pseudoscientific field of human breeding that was founded in Great Britain, enacted in various forms by the vast majority of American states, and became the foundation of Nazi Germany, with Nazis modeling laws and policies based on what succeeded in America and elsewhere. No, sorry. Seems to be a slide. Okay. Anyways, so as we study eugenics, it's very important to remember that it was never unique. Sir Francis Galton, the founder, he's a half cousin of Sir Charles Darwin, drew from pre-existing fields and biases when he created eugenics in 1883. So this overlap presented a major issue in determining when and how eugenics arrived in Vermont. I'll speak about that in a bit. So in the United States, we typically think about eugenics as largely limited to sterilization, and in Vermont, focused around the Eugenics Survey of Vermont. The survey investigated more than 60 Vermont families across the 1920s and 30s, and under the leadership of Henry Perkins, a UVM professor, and state officials, successfully pushed for a sterilization law in 1931. So one of the immediate questions when you look at the eugenics survey is why? Why did so many prominent Vermonters come together at such a select period of time when eugenics was actually already quite widespread across the US and then disappear into the sunset in the 1930s? So the reason this story doesn't make sense is because it's not the full history. When I began my research, I first looked at the eugenics survey records. They are the most prominent eugenics records we have, largely because they are explicitly labeled as eugenical records. And they give us a glimpse into how eugenics came to be. So from that research and building off the work of Nancy Gallagher, I took a look at the 1912 eugenics campaign under Governor Meade. And it turned out that that was fairly more widespread than we thought. That nearly led to a successful sterilization law and did lead to the creation of the Brandon State School for Feeble-Minded Children. So this is a letter from the superintendent of the Waterbury State Hospital to Governor Meade during Meade's preparation for this campaign. So besides giving us insight into the start of Vermont eugenics, it also highlights the range of eugenics in Vermont. Today, we generally recognize two forms of eugenics: positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics refers to eugenical programs that are designed to encourage desirable families to procreate. This area doesn't really get a lot of attention, and it's also much more difficult to trace. So in Vermont, we see this take the form of college lectures, and eugenicists would go to colleges across the country and inform young people that they were committing race suicide by pursuing higher education and not procreating. So young women especially should be going out and marrying and having children. We also see references in Vermont newspapers to families participating in Better Baby and Fitter Family contests. And we see the Eugenics Survey and the Vermont Commission on Country Life plan to educate everyday Vermonters on strengthening their families and practicing eugenical ideals. And one of the issues with tracing this is that contemporaries don't always refer to these as eugenics, and eugenicists also work to embed these as part of everyday life. Negative eugenics, on the other hand, is the form we most associate with eugenics in America. These are the policies to get rid of undesirable people and restrict their ability to procreate. So in Vermont, we see marriage restriction, family separation, sterilization, and most importantly, as Grout alludes to in this letter, segregation through the institutional system. So the idea is that you would take Vermonters out of society until they've aged out of procreation. You might send them to the Vermont Reform School, to the Waterbury Hospital, and after this legislative campaign, to the Brandon State School. So this is something that does become quite more prominent after the 1912 session and something we see referred to consistently. Segregation was likely the most commonplace form of negative eugenics in Vermont, but I'll discuss the barriers in understanding its range at the end of my talk. So now we have a quote from Henry Perkins. He is obviously the most well-known Vermont eugenicist. His quote here largely reflects Vermont eugenicists' attitude. There's some debate today over to the extent which eugenicists believe that undesirable traits were fully dominant. So that is, are they being passed on generation to generation, and are they inescapable? That's not the case in Vermont. We have records from Perkins and other eugenicists that pretty much demonstrate that Vermont eugenicists judge people rather in strict black and white terms. So going back to the records now and building off this quote, we have fairly comprehensive documentation of what Vermont eugenicists think, and that can mislead us into thinking that we have the full picture. But there's actually a good chunk of the narrative missing. While we have a number of public records at the state archives, private organizations were also involved in both positive and negative programs. With the exception of the Eugenics Survey, which is now housed at the state archives, we don't have those records available. This is particularly important in our understanding of education and sterilization programs, and I'll touch on sterilization also at the end of the talk. Most importantly, we only rarely hear the voices of the victims, so we're missing about 50% of that narrative. As this became increasingly apparent over the course of my research, one of the ways I approached this whole was by looking at other ways to understand the impact. If we're not going to hear from the victims, we do have records that demonstrate how people subjected to eugenics were treated. And there's also a lot of lies in the records that we do have, so you can't take something for granted just because it's written down. I'll get to that in a little bit. So, as I just previously touched on, it's difficult to determine the start of eugenics in Vermont because it comes out of a public welfare and health crisis in the late 1800s. And I would argue, as I spend chapter 1 discussing, its factors extend far before that. So this crisis was something repeatedly referred to by eugenicists in the 1910s and 20s. So one of the ways that I looked at this crisis to really understand what was going on was actually agricultural reports from the late 1800s. And beginning around the 1860s, we see agricultural leaders becoming alarmed that rural farms are shutting down and that Vermonters are leaving the state in droves. And we do have records that back this up. We can look at the census. We see that there's anemic growth in the state. We do see outward migration. The state does try to revitalize the agricultural sector and address depopulation, but it doesn't quite work. Meanwhile, as the state takes over public welfare from the towns and their poor farms, the disadvantaged are sent to the new state institutions. So pictured here are two of the earliest. We have the Waterbury Hospital, which is meant to treat the poor mentally ill. This is its successor. It's one of the other institutions was the private Brattleboro Retreat, which is still in existence today. And that dates back to the 1830s. And the Reform School, which is meant to take in juvenile delinquents. What happens instead is that towns end up using these institutions to get rid of everyone that they don't want or can't afford to take care of. And due to a number of reasons, there's already a number of Vermonters who are struggling financially and in terms of health. So we see the elderly and homeless sent over here. We see dependent children sent, and the towns make up reasons for commitment. That's something institutional officials are aware of and they don't correct. So these photos date to the later 1900s, but we see references to overcrowding from the start of the institutions. And one of these is from the Brandon Training School, which comes into existence in the 1910s. So state leaders see almost an immediate breakdown of the new institutional system. Seeing the rural population crisis and driven by their existing beliefs, leaders begin to argue that the Vermonters who remain are not as strong as those who came before. The new institutional system seems to back this up. It's overcrowded and constantly needs more funding. More and more Vermonters are being taken there every year. This reaction is fairly strong because they're idealizing the Revolutionary War era Vermonters. We see these references to the old stock throughout eugenics. And these references are key to understanding who eugenics targeted. So obviously we have people who don't come into the old stock. Those are the immigrants, Native Americans, and Black people. But eugenicists also target members of who would be the old stock because they're seen as not meeting the expectations of rural prosperity. So you have people who are targeted on the basis of physical and mental ability, behavior, perceived morality, and also inability to find socioeconomic success. And this panic is spurred in no small part by the institutions who have a growing interest in heredity. They've begun very informal tracking systems of who comes through their doors by the late 1800s. So beginning in the 1880s and 1890s, we see references to these tracking systems. And it's important to understand this both as a real crisis and a social panic. Both are equally important to the development of eugenics in the state. State leaders are trying to respond to real issues, but they're caught up in chasing the wrong thing. And their response worsens this crisis while strengthening future eugenicists' argument that we need to address heredity. And institutional leaders themselves turn the crisis and the overcrowding into something simple and easy to understand. Poor heredity is the cause. This comes before we see the term eugenics in Vermont and is one of the reasons that we have difficulty in determining the exact start of eugenics. So we see these references to heredity and also ongoing scientific work in that field beginning in the late 1800s. And that's the reason Mead draws so much support for his campaign in 1912. So it's also important to keep in mind that some eugenicists do see eugenics as a humane scientific answer. We can treat this as willful blindness, but we do need to understand the extent of the crisis that they're responding to and the lack of options available, whether that's due to lack of funding or lack of advanced medical treatments. So we see eugenics publicly emerge around the turn of the century in the 1912 legislative session. From that session comes the first attempt to pass a sterilization bill, and they very, very nearly succeed. It's actually only due to the fact that the bill was so detailed that the state attorney general deemed that it was discriminatory. If they had tried to just pass a blanket sterilization bill, they probably would have gone through it. And we do see the formation of a new institution to segregate feeble-minded children. From the start, Brandon is meant to carry out eugenical segregation. We see references to that by the superintendent and in public speeches. Outside of the 1912 legislative session and the Eugenics Survey of Vermont, tracing eugenics becomes a bit more complicated. As we see here, eugenics is a term that's not always used, even though we know for certain that they're referring to eugenics. By diving deeper into the language eugenicists used and the reasons they give for policies, we can trace the evolution of eugenics from the 1912 session into the later half of the century. But we do need to understand that we're not always going to see a record and it's going to be explicitly labeled that this is a eugenical case. We need to understand how eugenicists are referring to cases and the arguments that they're making, and especially when they start bringing out, well, we need to prevent procreation here. That's really a number one factor. So following World War II and the international horror and Nazi atrocities, eugenicists rebranded themselves and the term dropped out of use, even as these eugenical programs and policies remained in place nationally. At the federal level, we actually see more sterilizations occur after World War II than before. But again, there are issues with these records, so I will talk about that in a bit. So in Vermont, we do see public proposals for eugenical solutions repeated as late as the 1960s. The 1931 law isn't overturned until the 1970s. And the policies that they're proposing, again, don't use the word eugenics. The 1931 sterilization law isn't overturned until the 1970s, although it's quickly replaced by a forcible sterilization law that's still on the books today. That law doesn't contain eugenical language, but we also don't know how it's been implemented. And also the deciding case under the Supreme Court for legalizing sterilization for the good of the state was decided by a eugenical case, Buck v. Bell, in 1927. There's a lot of issues with that case. You may recall Holmes's famous quote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Although it's been publicly reported that sterilization ends in the early 1950s, we don't actually have any reason to think that that's the case besides the records stopping at that point. Contemporary accounts of sterilizations refer to the early 1950 dates because those contemporary accounts date to the same time. So right now, what we're really looking at is records from 1952 or 1953 saying how many sterilizations that there have been in Vermont. They can't predict the future. So it's an error to look at those records and say, well, that is a summary of all the sterilizations that have occurred. It's more likely that the records, the certificates of sterilization, and I'll show you an example in a little bit, were actually kept elsewhere and we just don't have access to them. But it is highly suspect that we have 20 years that the law was still in place and we have no sterilizations to account for in that period. So when I was carrying out my research, one of the things that stood out to me was how Vermont eugenics pamphlets resembled national eugenics. So this is a how-to guide from a place called the Eugenics Record Office. It's in Cold Springs, New York, and it was under the Carnegie Institution down there. And it's in the Eugenics Survey records. The Eugenics Record Office had a large degree of influence over Perkins. We know Perkins and the ERO's head. His name was Charles Davenport. He's a very prominent national eugenicist. We're in close correspondence, more so after Perkins expressed an interest in eugenics in the 1920s. The ERO also trained several of the survey field workers. So we know that there is a close relationship there. And this pamphlet is very important to understand because basically the ERO was reaching out to states and encouraging local eugenics organizations to carry out their own research. And in particular, family studies that were meant to show the expensive threat of poor heredity. So this is a family tree from one of these studies. It's called the Kallikak family. It's a very prominent one nationally, and it also gets reproduced in Germany. So eugenics organizations would present these family studies at conferences and fairs across the nation. The idea was that you had a very undesirable family procreating at an immense rate and costing the state Y amount of money. This is actually a little bit unusual in the fact that it's a straight line of descent. The reason for that is because they're investigating someone named Deborah, and it's actually centered around her. Typically for these family studies, you would have complex trees that looked very impressive when you looked at them. They really don't say that much. It's basically just a decorated circular tree with tons and tons of family members. But the important is that they look impressive. So we see here quite simply the veneer of scientific legitimacy that's being placed on these family studies. You have Martin Kallikak up at the center. He is an upstanding Revolutionary War man, and he has an affair with a feeble-minded barmaid and produces feeble-minded children. That's Deborah's line. His upstanding wife on the left, however, is quite upstanding and produces normal children. She's passing on good heredity. So this is meant to be a threat, and it's also meant to just summarize people up into one line. Are you degenerate or are you normal? Or in the case of what they're using here, feeble-minded. So this is a face sheet from the Eugenics Survey. The Eugenics Survey did publish family studies in their annual pamphlets, and we do see some of the family trees they reproduced. This wouldn't have been this was not reproduced for the public. But this was basically the summary that went before every family study. So when you go through the records, we have about 55 of the studies still surviving. You'll see this for all the families studied. And the idea is, again, that you get a person's entire life is summarized up as a statistic. Are they good or are they bad? Do we want them to procreate or not? So when we're interpreting the records, we have to understand that they're being made out in this guise of scientific legitimacy. People are very deliberately being presented as statistics. And we return once more to the institutional tracking system. So the institutions who knew that people were being sent there for under false reasons recorded people as being sent there for very deliberate things. So once you had that tracking being put on you, and we know the eugenics survey uses those records, you are doomed. That's who the eugenics survey is going to come out of. And you may have a case where it's a homeless child, but that's not what it's being recorded as. They're being recorded as juvenile delinquents. We have many cases where parents begged the institutions to take their children in, and at the Brandon Training School, they're being labeled feeble-minded. We have the elderly sent to the Waterbury Hospital for age-related conditions. And again, what it's coming down to is you become a statistic and your family is treated as part of that statistic. So we're going to return now to the records of how eugenics was carried out. This is a certificate of sterilization. It was mandated by the 1931 law. It's one of the few records we have that can absolutely determine if it's a eugenical case or not, because it is meant to be for eugenical cases. But there's a lot of issues with these records, including this idea of consent and how it was determined that somebody was a candidate. And you're going to see up there that the person being sterilized, and these could be children as young as 12, and then we see also cases up to the age of 45 and sometimes older. The records are still redacted to an extent. They would be asked to sign this as proof that they were consenting to this. And I go into this in more detail in the book, but we do have records that show that there was coercion applied. And then also in the cases of mentally disabled or mentally ill individuals, that they were being taken at their word that they were consenting to this, sometimes in discussions that were that were designed to lead them to agree to it. So we don't know the full extent of sterilization under the 1931 law. The law basically mandates, the way it's overseen is that a doctor would perform this. You would have the requisite 2 physicians testify that somebody is going to pass on their poor heredity, and you're meant to send it into the government. Somebody doesn't send in a certificate, who's going to know? State officials were aware that there were issues with the system. We do have a very prominent case from the Vermont Children's Aid Society where a certificate wasn't sent in. And it actually didn't become known until the case made its way into a local magazine. We also know across the country that it was fairly commonplace to have sterilization occur without the person's consent. So this could be under the guise of an appendectomy. It could also occur after childbirth. And we do continue to see those cases continue today. There's usually every few years, it pops up that an OBGYN has perhaps performed sterilizations while a woman is still directly after childbirth, while the woman is still in the hospital and still in the operating room. So jumping over to institutional segregation, we don't have such a clear-cut certificate to determine these cases. Segregational cases really have to be determined by cross-referencing records. And we know that institutional officials did practice segregation. We have their own words on that, and we have their own testimony to that. But segregational cases, you really can't, it's quite hard to make the determination until you see a very deliberate reference to procreation. But we know it's being carried out at a large scale. We just have difficulty in determining those individual cases. So, for example, the first superintendent of the Brandon Training School consistently refers to the school's purpose as segregating this class. That did change to some extent over time. We have later superintendents who are supporters of eugenics also referring to the fact that they have cases coming out of the institution because they've recovered. But these early case records that occur under the superintendent, for example, are not referred to as eugenical. So if you looked at the case records by themselves, you wouldn't quite be able to tell that. If you look at what he's saying, it becomes quite clear what he saw the school is doing. So over time, eugenicist's end goal was that certain families would be eliminated from the gene pool and others would thrive. But in the meantime, people can be put to work. So in Nazi Germany, we see fairly extensive killing programs being carried out. That's not the case in the US. So instead, we see the institutional system, which is meant to get rid of people. So even though we see eugenics use the terminology in medicine, they actually discuss eugenical cases in terms of trainability. We see children and adults being put to work at the institutions and in the institutions' colonies, but largely removed from society. And most importantly, the term that we typically see being used is feeble-mindedness, which is not on this sheet. This is the various diagnoses that you could get. But basically this idea that there were feeble-minded people. And this diagnosis was fairly broad. This could include blue-collar workers. This could include women who had had children out of wedlock, youthful indiscretions, drug and alcohol use, behavior that was seen basically as strange, and just differing from the norms. So when we see the word feeble-minded, the idea that's really the threat eugenicists fear the most, because they can pass as normal in society, or so they claim, and basically somebody would unknowingly marry somebody who is feeble-minded and produce, as Martin Kallikak did, feeble-minded children. So it's a derogatory term, and it's being used to this extent to just target a whole range of people that today we would not necessarily recognize as having a condition that we would think of as for grounds for being sent to an institution. So to sum it up, it's important to look at eugenics as it was designed to be implemented. It's intergenerational. You may be targeting one person, but you're actually targeting the entire family unit. Eugenicists intended to break up the family, and if they can't prevent procreation entirely, limit the family from prospering and cause intergenerational harm that would, over time, destroy the family unit. So with that, I'd like to pass it over for questions. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, excellent. So we have about 15 minutes or so for questions, and we do have some cookies and some cold water in the other room for you, but we wanted to leave a little time for any questions. And as I said, on November 9th, Mercedes is going to be doing a much more in-depth, longer presentation as well. And of course, you can read the book for a lot more information. So are there any questions in the room? And I think we'll be hearing some over online through somebody else.
I lived in Germany in the 70s and became acquainted with professor of physics at the Universität Marburg. And he was targeted by the Nazis when he was a youth. And his family had lots of money, and they were able to save him by demonstrating the fact that he could ski. He had some kind of physical disability, which most people would call spastic or whatever in his mannerism. He was obviously a brilliant man, but did that happen also in Vermont, where people with physical disabilities were also targeted?
Okay, thank you for that question. It's really good. So in Vermont, it's really important, and we don't have enough research on what happened elsewhere in America. But in Vermont, what really happened was that you would see towns commit local citizens. And that actually gets into a debate about towns over who is not a local citizen and who they have to care for, but I won't get into that right now. But basically, we see towns being responsible for sending people to the institutions. So we do see references fairly early on at the Brandon Training School for children who are actually being sent in for physical disabilities and not mental disabilities. But once they were at the institution, that's when they would come under eugenics. So eugenicists weren't really going around the state and bringing people in to be subjected to eugenics. You did see some mobile clinics. You did see institutions sometimes send officials over to local towns, but for the most part, the town would have to send you in. And which is to answer your question, we do see cases where children with physical disabilities or adults with physical disabilities were being swept up in this.
So I read somewhere, not quite sure what article or book it might have been, that there were state-sponsored midwives that would go around, assist with births, and then possibly sterilize the mother. Is there any truth to that in the research that you found?
Repeat your question. too.
Oh, okay. The question is that there are reports of state-sponsored midwives that would go around and perhaps sterilize women after they had given childbirth. So there's a potential that that did occur. We don't have records right now that indicate that, but people like to summarize sterilization in Vermont. We like to put a number on it. We like to say we know everything that happened. As I discussed in here, the certificates are really problematic. They suggest to us that we know everything there is to know about sterilization, but we know certificates weren't sent in. I would say because this did occur in other states, it probably wouldn't be a midwife. It would probably be in a hospital. The sterilization that they were performing on women was quite extensive and would require hospitalization.
Just a quick note here before Peter's next. Those on Zoom, please enter your question into the Q&A function and we will read them out for you. So sorry, Peter.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you if your research allowed you to distinguish the identity of the referral mechanism at the town level. I ask that because I'm not sure whether we're talking about the local government structure or the educational structure, both of which were highly decentralized, localized throughout the early 20th century.
Thank you. That's a great question. So the question is, who at the town level was responsible for the commitments to the institutions? So we see it vary in different cases. We have sometimes families who try to get their own family members committed. We also see basically local town officials. It would have to go before a court system to make that commitment. You're being forcibly committed. It's not something, we actually have a quote from the Brandon superintendent who complains about parents just trying to ship children off or towns just trying to ship people off, as if it was just as lovely if you could just ship them off and not have to fill out anything. But basically what we see is that the towns have to go, whoever is doing the commitment in the town basically has to go through the local court system. So there does have to be some record of that. And then basically once they're committed by the court, they're sent off to the institution. So families could do it. We also see people who are placed in the poor farms. The head of the poor farm would ship them off. And then basically as local official, so basically anyone in the town government could do it. And then in terms of the educational system, there may have been cases through the educational system. It's usually not done through that route, but we do see references in the eugenics survey records and in later attempts that they're really trying to get the local education system more involved in figuring out who may have a mental disability or who may fall under what they're calling feeble-mindedness, and which is really quite a broad range of things.
Do we have any online questions? I just don't want to ignore those.
We do.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Emily, thank you.
Yes. We have a question whether there were specific diseases that were targeted, specifically degenerative neurological diseases like Huntington's.
That's a great question. So we do know that in the eugenics survey records, there's several family studies that are actually published out of the 62. One of them is a family who does have Huntington's. We don't actually know if the family did have Huntington's. That's only recently been able to be thoroughly diagnosed. But at the time, and there's also records that indicate that they may not have had Huntington's. So we don't quite know. There were a number of diseases that they suspected were due to heredity, but they're really sweeping up anyone who comes under this banner of having any range of conditions. They're not specifically going out into the community and have a list of diseases or disorders that they're going to target and trying to sweep up everyone who has those.
What's in the room? Emily Moore from online.
Yes, we have another question. To what extent were Vermont colleges and universities engaged in pro-eugenic research?
Okay, that's a great question. Most American colleges and universities, including Vermont's, offered eugenic courses, and we see references to those into the 1940s. Again, this comes under the problem of after the 1940s, the term is abandoned and they're still teaching eugenics, but they're not calling it eugenics, which is quite invasive and it's very hard to trace. We do see a number of people from Vermont colleges and universities involved in the Eugenics Survey of Vermont and its cadet branch, the Vermont Commission on Country Life. For a full list of those people, it is in the appendix of the book. So we do know that there were some outward participants, but we know that most colleges and universities were teaching this.
Yes.
Oh, maybe this is a given because I'm hearing, but I think it's the answer to this question, but referencing to the question of a woman who lived in Germany and a family that was well-to-do, is what's happening in Vermont, you know, the ones referred or targeted, is it as much reflection of rural poverty and families and towns being unable to provide any kind of support for whatever individual, whatever age that might need more help or more assistance, whether they're elderly or young or in between. So the 20s, I mean, the depression is certainly in rural America in the 20s, agricultural America.
Thank you. Thank you. So the question was, to what extent is this a reflection of rural poverty in Vermont? And that really was an important point for me to tackle. Early on in the 1800s, we do see a very large range of rural poverty. It doesn't just come about because of the Great Depression. And there are several laws that basically make towns responsible for the care of their poor and the care of their sick, but there is not a funding mechanism put into place for them to be able to actually afford this. So we do see towns that deliberately just kind of shunt off and spend the least amount of money on their poor. We also know that there were towns that could not afford to do more. And while they're being required by the state, they don't have the means to do so. So it's a pretty bad system that does worsen the situation we see at hand. And then under the institutions, all of those people that basically hadn't been cared for are sent into the institutional systems. And that's what leads to the overcrowding, because this rural poverty is not addressed. And that situation only continues to worsen because nobody at the institutions are really getting better. And actually, when we see, especially for the Vermont Reform School and also the Brandon Training School, the cases there, basically, you're setting children up for deep trauma for the rest of their lives. We know now that the earliest 3 years of your life, actually continuing on into childhood, are so important and so critical for the development of the brain. And when you are in foster care situations where you're not being held, where you're just being put in a room with other people, where you don't have those family bonds, that can damage the brain and damage just your life for the rest of your life, that you're going to be put, even if you come out of the institution, you are going to have a hard time finding emotional bonds. And you're going to have a hard time also making correct decisions. That trauma in the brain is quite serious.
In the back.
Yes, thank you for coming today. Thank you for the book. Could you speak to many private institutions at the time period that far exceeded the number of state institutions? And I'm not referring to semi-governmental private institutions such as the Bradbury Tree. I'm speaking to many smaller private institutions that specifically took in children.
Thank you for that question. So the question was whether I could speak to the private organizations that were involved in this. So we know through very good records that a number of foster care organizations were involved. We know most prominent is the Vermont Children's Aid Society, but we also see the Kern-Haddon School also getting involved in the Eugenics Survey and the Vermont Commission on Country Life. We see references in the Eugenics Survey records that they are soliciting reports and records from a number of foster care organizations across the state, and that they're using those records to target families. And some of the people later referred to do end up sterilized. We do have those records. it's highly likely that a number of foster care organizations in the state also participated in sterilization after 1931. We do have, again, the very prominent case from the Vermont Children's Aid Society, but there are a lot of oral histories that do suggest that foster care organizations were helping to carry out sterilizations, including on children and young adults. So it's one of the areas that we know the records are missing. They're not in the state archives. They may be lost to time, or they're being kept just in a jumble of records in basements across the state. But we do know that those records are missing, and we do know that there was a high degree of participation.
Emily, do you have another? Sorry, I'm just gonna check online. Another question from online?
Yes, we have one more. Question is, how did women's lack of control over childbearing play a role in the eugenics movement?
Yes, that's a really good question. So we don't have birth control at the time. There are obviously forms of birth control that date to Roman times or before. But we don't see the formal arrival of birth control in the US until the 1930s and 1940s. That's not to say that there isn't. But for women of a lower socioeconomic class, they're vulnerable in a way that does leave them open to being targeted by local officials and by the institutions. So we see in the institutions that treat children, we do see a number of cases that are basically sent in of young girls and women who basically the records suggest that they may have been the victim of rape or sexual abuse, and that case of them being caught in bed or a resulting pregnancy is used against them. The perpetrator usually is not punished with them unless it's an extreme case. So we do see basically women and girls who may not have a choice in becoming pregnant, and basically that pregnancy out of wedlock is going to be put down as a mark against them that they are somehow feeble-minded.
One more, and I think we're going to reach our time limit here. We'll have further conversations together with Sarah.
I was just curious about a research possibility, which I'm not sure exists, but if people have left to repositories the notes they took in college courses, would that or has that been a route for research? For instance, when I was at UVM as an undergraduate in the 60s, there certainly were courses in the catalog for genetics, heredity, scientific courses, presumably, but what was being imparted? And, when did that change? If you look at somebody's notes from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, would there have been different slants on the information being imparted?
It would be hugely, sorry, the question was, I need to repeat the questions. The question was basically, would notes from college courses and other educational programs be helpful in determining the teaching of eugenics in schools? Absolutely. It was not something that was readily available when I was doing my research. But basically one of the issues that we're seeing in understanding the extent of education is, first off, the lack of the use of the term eugenics. So even before World War II, it may not have been referred to as eugenics. And then after World War II, that's abandoned entirely. They turn instead to genetic organizations and heredity, and just general teachings of heredity. But when you are looking at those, it's obviously there are legitimate genetic classes. You're actually understanding that. So it can be hard to delineate when eugenic teachings creep into it. And one thing that they were eugenicists were really focused on was, for example, genetic testing. That is something that we see still prevalent today, and it's taken as common sense that you should have genetic testing done. Does that mean everyone who is taking part in genetic testing is a eugenicist? Absolutely not. And there can be a number of personal reasons to latch onto these ideas or to take part in them. But that doesn't mean necessarily that eugenicists wouldn't have been happy to see so many of these being practiced today, or that there's just this common sense idea. But again, you have what eugenicists would be happy for, and then you have just practicality, what medicine is practicing now. I hope that made sense.
Well, thank you so much.
Complex.
Yep.
I'm just going to jump back in front so the microphone can pick me up for everybody online. Thank you so much for participating in our annual meeting. And like I said, this was a taste of the research. Please read the book. Mercedes will be back with us again on November 9th. Thank you to our members. You really make this happen for us, and you're the backbone of this organization. And we'll see those who are in person next door. Thank you.